Paris, 1752. A candle flickers in the corner of a silk-draped room, throwing trembling light on a young woman's face, pale, powdered, and streaked with tears. Her name is Élise de Montreux, daughter of a noble line that once owned half of Burgundy. Tomorrow, her father will sign the contract that sells her, not into love nor alliance, but into a marriage that feels more like a sentence. The man waiting on the other side is 3 times her age, rumored to have strangled his first wife in a fit of jealousy. And yet, in the eyes of French society, this union is celebrated as fortune, not tragedy. Outside, Paris hums with life. The smell of roasted chestnuts, the clatter of carriages, the echo of laughter drifting from brothels and opera halls. But beneath the gilded ceilings of aristocracy, young noble women like Élise live as prisoners of elegance, sold in whispers, traded for titles, bartered for land. Their dowries are their shackles, their surnames their cages. Centuries later, their stories remain buried beneath marble and myth, but the letters, diaries, and scandalous court records tell another truth, that hundreds of women of noble blood were quietly sold into marriages that became prisons of humiliation, madness, and death. This is their story, one of beauty and brutality, luxury and loss. Forgotten French noble women who paid the highest price for their family's ambition. Before we begin, if you believe history, you should remember not only kings and conquerors, but the silenced and the broken, then consider subscribing. Like this video, share it, and follow us for more true stories from the darker side of history, where power, love, and tragedy meet beneath the weight of time. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Montreux estate, spilling across the marble floors in soft ribbons of gold. Servants moved quietly, their footsteps muffled against the Persian carpets. In the grand salon, a girl of 17 sat before an ornate mirror while her governess adjusted the lace at her collar. Her name was Élise de Montreux, daughter of Count Henri de Montreux, a man whose fortune had withered faster than his pride. The house that once hosted grand banquets now echoed with silence, the silver sold, the wines watered down. Yet on this morning, a fragile hope hung in the air. The Count believed salvation had arrived, and it wore the face of his daughter. Élise's reflection stared back at her with trembling composure. Her skin was pale, powdered perfection, her lips a shade of rose too deep for comfort. Beneath her bodice, her heart pounded, not from vanity, but from dread. For today, she would be displayed before the man who might save her family, a baron from Normandy, a man whose wealth could restore her father's crumbling estate, a man whose eyes, rumor said, had never softened even when he smiled. Outside, Paris gleamed distant, unreachable. The laughter of the city's youth, the hum of the Seine, the smell of bread from the morning market, all of it belonged to another world. The world Élise dreamed of when she read forbidden books under her covers at night. In her secret moments, she imagined freedom as something tangible, a walk by the river, a conversation not measured by etiquette, a marriage chosen for love. But in the drawing rooms of nobility, dreams were a currency more dangerous than debt. Her father entered, his cane tapping against the marble like the ticking of a clock. His once proud shoulders stooped beneath years of financial ruin. He kissed her forehead, his eyes hollow with calculation disguised as tenderness. "You must smile, ma fille," he murmured. "He will be watching." His words carried the weight of finality, not advice but command. Élise nodded, her throat tightening. She had practiced her smile for weeks, the kind that showed grace without joy. It was a smile of every noble daughter taught that duty was destiny. By noon, the baron arrived. His carriage wheels crushed the gravel like bones. The servants lined the courtyard, the family standing poised at the top of the stairs. Élise's mother, elegant but brittle, extended her hand with the delicacy of one who had long practiced the art of endurance. The baron was tall, his coat adorned with medals, his wig immaculate, but his eyes were cold, assessing. When his gaze fell on Élise, it lingered a heartbeat too long. She curtsied, feeling the air tighten between them like a drawn string. He bowed slightly, the faintest smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. Dinner was served in the glow of a dozen candles, each flickering like a warning. Conversation was polite, rehearsed, and lifeless. The baron spoke of estates, of politics, of his late wife in a tone so casual it chilled the room. Élise's father laughed at all the right moments, refilling their guest glass with trembling hands. The young girl spoke only when spoken to, her voice barely above a whisper. And yet, beneath her quiet surface, her thoughts raced, calculating, observing, searching for something human in the man across the table. She found none. Later that evening, after the carriages had departed and the house returned to silence, Élise wandered the balcony overlooking the gardens. The air smelled of rain and rosewater. She gripped the railing until her knuckles whitened. Below, the statues stood motionless, their marble eyes staring into nothingness. It struck her then how similar they were, sculpted for beauty, admired from afar, yet voiceless and unfree. Somewhere inside, a small rebellion stirred, quiet and fragile like the first breath of a storm. But rebellion in her world was a luxury only men could afford. That night, she overheard her parents speaking in the study. Through the half-open door, their words came in hushed tones, urgent and heavy. Her father's voice trembled with relief. "It's settled," he said. "The dowry will be enough to cover the debts. The contract will be signed within the week." Her mother's reply was softer, but filled with something Élise had never heard before, pity. "And our daughter?" she whispered. Her father's silence was answer enough. Élise pressed her palm to her lips to stifle a cry. The sound of ink scratching paper became the sound of her freedom fading. The following days passed like a dream she could not wake from. The household buzzed with preparations. Seamstresses, jewelers, perfumers, all summoned to transform her into a bride fit for a baron. Every ribbon tied, every corset lace felt like another chain tightening around her body. When she stood before the mirror in her wedding gown, she saw not a woman, but a ghost. Beautiful, yes, but hollow. In the reflection, her eyes looked older, wiser, already distant from the world that surrounded her. The night before the wedding, she found her governess in tears. The old woman clasped Élise's hands and whispered, "Do not lose your soul, child. Even in his house, keep something of your own, a secret thought, a memory, a prayer." Élise nodded, though her heart felt heavy as lead. She promised herself she would remember. She would keep one piece of herself untouched, even if the rest was sold. As the bells of St. Roch began to toll the dawn, the carriages lined the street. Paris awoke to another day of laughter, markets, and gossip. But in the Montreux estate, a girl was being led to her fate, veiled in silk and silence. Somewhere in the crowd, a child released a white dove, and for a brief moment, Élise lifted her eyes to the sky. The bird rose higher, its wings flashing in the sun, free and unbound. For the first time, Élise understood the cruelty of beauty, how it could deceive, how it could imprison, how it could make The church was filled with the scent of lilies and candle wax. Beneath the vaulted ceiling, Élise walked slowly down the aisle, her hand trembling against her father's arm. The organ thundered through the air like the voice of God himself, and yet all she could hear was the sound of her heartbeat, frantic, desperate, pleading for escape. Rows of powdered faces turned to watch her, each masked in admiration and envy, their whispers fluttering like moths. They saw a girl draped in silk, pearls shimmering against her throat, but none could see the panic behind her calm. Her future husband, the Baron de Villeroy, waited at the altar, his face unreadable beneath his powdered wig. He extended his hand, and she placed hers upon it, cold against cold. The priest's voice echoed through the chamber, reciting vows that felt less like promises than curses. When he spoke the words to love, to honor, and to obey, Élise's breath caught, not from joy but from surrender. The ring slid onto her finger like a shackle. The applause that followed felt hollow, distant, as though she were watching someone else live this moment. Afterward, the celebration began in the grand ballroom of her family's estate. Music filled the air, violins, flutes, and laughter so bright it almost drowned her thoughts. Champagne flowed like a river, and the guests toasted endlessly to love, fortune, and union. But Élise could see in their eyes. They were not celebrating her happiness. They were admiring her value. She had become her father's redemption, his living debt repaid. When the Baron leaned close to kiss her cheek, the smell of his cologne, musk and tobacco, turned her stomach. As the night deepened, the candles burned lower, their wax dripping like tears down golden holders. Élise stood at the edge of the ballroom, staring at the reflections in the mirrors, dozens of versions of herself, all equally lost. Her mother approached, her face painted with a proud but fragile smile. "You did well, my darling," she whispered. "He is pleased." Élise nodded, though she felt a terrible weight settle upon her chest. Her mother's eyes softened, just for an instant. "You will learn to live with it," she said quietly. It was not comfort. It was prophecy. The carriage ride to Normandy was silent. Outside, the world blurred into gray, trees, fields, the faint outline of villages fading beneath the fog. Inside, Élise sat rigid beside her husband, her hands clasped in her lap. The Baron stared straight ahead, the corner of his mouth twitching occasionally as if lost in thought. She dared not speak. When he finally turned to her, his voice was measured, almost kind. "You are fortunate, madam," he said. "You will want for nothing." She managed a faint nod, though his words chilled her. Want for nothing, except freedom, laughter, love. Except herself. The Baron's estate stood upon a lonely hill overlooking a forest that seemed to stretch endlessly into shadow. The manor was vast but unwelcoming, its stone walls gray and cold, the windows dark even in daylight. The servants bowed as they arrived, their faces unreadable, their eyes avoiding hers. Inside, the air smelled of dust and iron. Her footsteps echoed through corridors lined with portraits, solemn ancestors gazing down with judgmental eyes. That night, Élise was shown to her chamber, grand, yes, but barren of warmth. Heavy drapes, a bed carved with angels that seemed to watch her. A fire flickered weakly in the hearth, unable to chase away the chill. She stood before the mirror and removed her veil. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to weep. The tears came silently, running over her painted cheeks, blurring perfection that others had so carefully constructed. A knock on the door silenced her sobs. It was the Baron. He entered without waiting for permission. "You must understand," he said, his tone clipped but not cruel. "In this house there are rules. Appearances must be preserved. There will be dinners, guests, expectations. You will play your part, and in return, you will be comfortable. Defiance," he paused, letting the word linger like a blade, "is unbecoming of a wife." Élise lowered her eyes. "Yes, my lord." He stepped closer. The air between them thickened. "Good," he murmured. "You learn quickly." He lifted her chin with a gloved hand, studying her as though inspecting fine porcelain. "I trust there will be no need for correction." When he left, the door closed with a sound that felt like the sealing of a tomb. The days that followed blurred into one another. Mornings filled with embroidery lessons she didn't need. Afternoons spent alone in the garden where even the flowers seemed subdued. She wrote letters to her mother that were never sent, for each was inspected by the Baron's steward. Every word she wrote was weighed, measured, and censored. The walls of the manor seemed to close in, whispering of the lives of women who had come before her. Silent wives, forgotten names. At night, she heard footsteps in the halls. Sometimes, the Baron's voice echoing distantly. Sometimes, something else, a faint weeping she could not locate. Once, she found a locked door at the end of the west wing. When she asked the maid about it, the woman crossed herself and muttered, "That room is not to be entered, madam. Not by you." Élise said nothing, but the thought burrowed into her mind like a splinter. "Not by you." The words repeated themselves through her sleepless nights, mingling with the sound of wind against the shutters. One evening, as she brushed her hair by candlelight, her reflection caught movement behind her, a shadow crossing the corridor. She turned sharply, heart pounding, but found nothing there, only the flame flickering, the silence pressing in. She told herself it was nothing, imagination, the mind playing tricks in solitude. And yet, deep down, she knew something within these walls was not meant to rest. As she extinguished the candle and lay in bed, the darkness seemed alive, breathing, listening, waiting. Somewhere in the manor, a door creaked open, followed by a faint, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps pacing. Élise closed her eyes and whispered a prayer she barely remembered. The velvet cage had shut, and inside it, she was no longer a daughter nor a bride, but something far more fragile, a possession trying to remember how to breathe. Winter crept across Normandy like a slow sickness. The trees stood bare and skeletal, and the sea winds carried a chill that gnawed through stone. In the Baron's manor, Élise learned to move without sound, to speak only when spoken to exist as quietly as possible. Days blurred into a pattern of ritual. Morning prayers, solitary meals, long walks through the frostbitten gardens under the watchful eyes of servants. Her husband was often absent, but his presence lingered everywhere, heavy as smoke. When he did appear, it was with a cruel precision that unsettled her. He would enter her chambers without warning, inspecting her posture, her dress, her letters. A wife, he once said, is the reflection of her husband's order. Disorder in her is disorder in home. His words were cold, almost mechanical, and Élise learned to nod, to smile faintly, to survive the scrutiny. Yet beneath the obedience, something within her began to fracture, a quiet rebellion growing in the cracks of fear. One night, a storm rolled in from the coast. The thunder echoed through the corridors, rattling the windows. Élise sat awake, her candle trembling in its holder. The Baron had returned from a trip to Paris, his mood darker than she'd ever seen. He accused her of gossiping, of drawing attention in his absence. She denied it, but her denial only amused him. In Paris, he sneered, they say noble women forget their place. I will not have such shame in my house. His hand struck her before she could breathe. The sound rang through the chamber like a verdict. When he left, she did not cry. She simply touched her cheek and stared into the mirror, studying the red marks spreading across her skin. It felt unreal, a seal, a symbol. That night, she made her first entry in a hidden journal, written with trembling hands behind a loose panel near her bed. I am not afraid, she wrote, but I do not yet know what it means to live. Outside, the storm raged until dawn, tearing branches from the trees and howling through the chimneys. Inside, Élise's candle burned low, her reflection flickering in the mirror like a ghost caught between two worlds, one of duty, one of awakening. Morning came gray and heavy. The manor was silent, except for the scraping of the servants' brooms along the corridor floors. Élise awoke with her cheeks still tender, the faint bruise a reminder of her place in the world she had been sold into. The Baron was gone before sunrise, leaving only a note on the table. Terse instructions about dinner, the guest list for the coming weekend, and a reminder, a wife's grace is her husband's dignity. She folded the paper slowly, feeling each word like a blade. The house felt emptier in his absence, yet never safe. In the garden, frost covered the rose bushes like a shroud. As she walked, she noticed a young maid watching her. Timid, no more than 16. The girl's name was Colette, and she served as one of the Baron's new attendants. When Élise caught her gaze, Colette looked down quickly, but later, as Élise passed in the corridor, the girl slipped a small folded scrap into her hand. It was a warning, just 3 words written in trembling ink. Don't trust him. That evening, Élise hid the note beneath her mattress and tried to quiet the pounding in her chest. What did the girl mean? Had others suffered here before her? The locked door at the end of the west wing returned to her thoughts, haunting and insistent. She had tried to forget it, but now it seemed to call to her in dreams, always half open, always whispering. Days passed. The Baron's temper grew shorter. Servants moved like ghosts, careful never to speak above a whisper. Élise began to sense that fear had long been part of this household, woven into the very walls. Once, during a late supper, she asked the steward about the previous mistress of the estate. The man paled, his eyes darting to the door. Madam, he murmured, some things are better left to God. That night, unable to sleep, Élise rose from bed and lit a candle. She moved silently down the corridor, her bare feet cold against the marble floor. When she reached the west wing, the air grew colder still. The locked door loomed before her, heavy oak, iron hinges, a keyhole like a staring eye. She pressed her ear to it. Nothing. Then, faintly, something, a single soft sound, almost like a sigh. Her candle trembled. Élise turned and fled, her heartbeat echoing through the empty halls. The storm had quieted to a distant moan by the time a soul dared to move again. The manor had fallen into an unnatural stillness, the kind that hummed with unseen eyes. Every corner seemed to breathe, every candle's flicker whispering secrets older than the stones beneath her feet. She clutched her candle tightly, its trembling light chasing the shadows that dared to close in. Drawn by a sound, a faint melody, almost a lullaby, Isolde found herself at the end of a long, narrow corridor she hadn't seen before. The air grew colder with each step, the floorboard sighing under her bare feet as if reluctant to bear her weight. The tune was clearer now, sung in a woman's voice, soft, sorrowful, and filled with yearning. When she reached the final door, she hesitated. The melody stopped. The silence that followed was louder than thunder. She pushed the door open. Inside was a small, circular room lit by a single candle on a rusted stand. The walls were covered in old portraits. Women, all dressed in dark wedding gowns, their eyes scratched out as though by desperate hands. In the center stood a cracked mirror, draped in a black veil. The air smelled faintly of wilted roses and something older, something dead. As Isolde stepped closer, she saw a movement behind the veil. A figure, a bride, her gown stained and her face hidden, stood reflected in the mirror, even though no one stood before it in the room. Isolde froze. The figure lifted its hand, and the mirror began to whisper, "Why did you return, my sweet Isolde?" The voice was both hers and not hers, echoing from deep within the glass. "You promised me rest, but you brought the storm back with you." Tears welled in Isolde's eyes. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The veil in the reflection fluttered, and for a heartbeat, she saw her own face, pale, terrified, and wearing the same black gown. The candle extinguished itself with a hiss. In the sudden darkness, a cold hand brushed her cheek. "You are me," the whisper said. Isolde screamed. The Beaumont estate was not a home. It was a cage padded in velvet, dressed in silk and perfumed with decay. Each dawn arrived like a pale intruder, filtering through lace curtains into a world too quiet, too orderly. The Baron's servants glided silently across the marble floors, never daring to meet Élise's eyes. When she spoke, they lowered their heads. When she laughed, on rare days when laughter found her, they flinched as though joy were forbidden here. The Baron himself kept to his routines with the precision of a soldier. He dined precisely at 7, rode in his study until 10, and dismissed his wife with a kiss so cold it burned. His affection had become a ritual of ownership, a hand placed too firmly on her arm, a whisper that wasn't tenderness but command. Élise began to write letters she never sent, in her private journal. Hidden beneath the floorboard near her vanity, she chronicled the days as if to remind herself that she was still alive. "The walls have ears," she wrote one night, "but I whisper anyway, for silence is its own kind of death." She wasn't entirely alone. Among the servants, there were murmurs, quiet exchanges behind closed doors, glances too quick to be innocent. One afternoon, as Élise crossed the corridor toward the library, she overheard two maids whispering near the staircase. "Did you hear?" one murmured. "The Count's wife in Bordeaux vanished. They say she took her own life." The other replied, "No, she was taken back to her husband's family, a punishment for disobedience." When they saw Élise, the maids froze. The younger one, no older than 17, curtsied so deeply her hands trembled. "Forgive us, madam, idle gossip." But the words lingered, vanished, disobedience. That night, Élise stared at her reflection by candlelight. Her beauty, once praised and envied, had become a mask. Her eyes, once bright, now carried the dull sheen of resignation. "How many of us disappear," she whispered, "before someone dares to speak." She began listening, truly listening, to the walls, footsteps above her room, the faint rustle of paper behind the study door, and once a voice, a woman's, sobbing softly somewhere in the east corridor. By morning, the sound was gone. Only silence remained, heavy and knowing. And Élise understood then. This was not a house of love. It was a house of whispers, where truth lived only in secret and the cost of speech was everything. The days following Élise's discovery in the West Wing blurred into a feverish haze. She no longer ate much, nor did she sleep soundly. When she did sleep, She dreamed of faces she didn't know. Women's faces, pale and frightened, their mouths open in silent screams. Each time she woke, she thought she heard their whispers fading through the walls. The Baron noticed her growing frailty, but not out of concern. "You look dreadful," he remarked one evening over supper, slicing into his meat with lazy precision. "A wife of mine should not wilt like a flower. See to yourself, or I'll see to you." Élise said nothing. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her spoon, pretending to sip the cold broth. When he left the room, she let the spoon fall back into the bowl and sat still, staring at the firelight dancing along the silverware. There, in the faint shimmer, she thought she saw movement, a reflection behind her. When she turned, no one was there. The following morning, Colette found her pacing near the grand staircase, her eyes hollow. "Madam, you mustn't wander so," the maid whispered. "The Baron forbade it." Élise caught her by the wrist. "You told me once not to trust him. Tell me why." Colette froze, eyes darting to corners as if the walls themselves might listen. "Not here," she murmured, voice trembling. "Meet me tonight, after midnight, in the servants' chapel." That night, the manor lay still beneath a heavy fog. Élise crept through the corridors, guided by the faint flicker of her candle. Every step seemed to echo, every shadow to watch. When she reached the chapel, she found Colette waiting, but not alone. On the stone altar lay a portrait draped in black cloth. Colette hesitated before pulling it away. Beneath it was the face of another woman, beautiful, regal, and hauntingly familiar. The name card beneath read, "Isabelle Duval, Baroness of Lisbourne." Élise's heart pounded. "Who is she?" Colette's eyes filled with tears. "She was his wife before you, madam. She vanished one night, and none of us were allowed to speak her name again." Before Élise could reply, the wind outside rose and shrieked. The chapel doors slammed shut on their own, and faintly from the walls a voice whispered, not from either of them, "He never lets us leave." The days that followed the discovery of Isabelle's portrait marked the beginning of Élise's awakening. The whispers that haunted her once filled her with terror. Now they spoke to her with purpose. They murmured of justice, of vengeance, of freedom. And though she still trembled at night, something within her had hardened, outside the manor walls. France itself was beginning to tremble. News reached even the isolated estate. Peasants rising, nobles fleeing, and rumors of blood running through the streets of Paris. The servants whispered of a revolution, of heads rolling beneath the guillotine. But inside the barren stone fortress, time felt suspended, a cruel parody of peace. One evening, the Baron hosted a small gathering of his aristocratic peers, men who laughed too loudly and drank too deeply, oblivious to the chaos brewing beyond their gilded walls. Élise was ordered to attend, to smile and serve as the ornament of his power. As the men discussed politics, their voices thick with arrogance, Élise caught fragments, traitors, mob, the rabble at our gates. The Baron boasted, "The revolution will never touch Lisbourne. I have guards, walls, and loyalty bought with coin and fear." But Élise saw the flicker of unease behind his confidence. He was a man who had built his life on control, and control was slipping away, both in his country and within his own home. Later that night, while the guests slept in drunken stupor, Élise returned to the chapel. The portrait of Isabelle seemed almost alive in the candlelight, her painted eyes shimmering with sorrow. Élise reached out and whispered, "What did he do to you?" From behind her, Colette appeared silently, her face pale. "He buried her," she said, voice quivering. "Not in the earth, in the walls. There are bodies behind these stones, madam. The Baron's first wife and others who disobeyed him." Élise's breath caught. "Others?" "Yes. Servants who tried to flee. A girl who refused his hand. He sealed them in so the world would forget." Élise felt the room tilt. The whispers returned, soft at first, then louder, urgent, as if dozens of voices called her name. The candle flame shuddered, casting wild shadows across the chapel. Colette clutched her arm. "The world outside is changing, madam. Blood for blood. If the people come, you must choose. Will you flee with them, or make him pay?" Élise looked toward the grand staircase that led back to her prison of gold. The decision had already been made somewhere deep within her. For the first time, the whispers did not frighten her. They sounded like an army. The first crack of thunder that night was not from the heavens. It was from the gate. The sound of splintering would echo through the corridors like a war drum. From the windows, Élise saw the glow of torches illuminating the fog, the distant roar of voices carried by the wind. The revolution had come to Lisborne. The Baron stumbled into the hall, half-dressed, his powdered wig askew, barking orders at trembling servants. To the armory, lock the gates. I'll not let these animals touch my house. His voice cracked, equal parts fury and fear. The guards rushed to obey, but they were few, and the mob was many. Élise stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching the chaos unfold below. For years, she'd been a ghost in this house, unseen, unheard. Tonight, she felt terrifyingly alive. The doors burst open. A flood of peasants stormed inside, faces wild with anger and hunger. The marble floors, once pristine, were soon trampled in mud and blood. The Baron raised his pistol, shouting, "You dare!" But his words were drowned by the mob's cry. For France! For justice! A shot rang out. Then another. The chandelier shattered, raining crystal like glass rain. The Baron fell back, blood blooming across his silk waistcoat. He tried to crawl toward Élise, his voice rasping. "Help me, my wife." She descended the stairs slowly, her white gown ghost-like in the candlelight. "You never call me that," she whispered. The crowd paused as she knelt beside him, not in mercy, but in reckoning. "You made this house a tomb. Now it shall be yours." His trembling hand reached for her, but she turned away. The mob seized him, dragging him toward the courtyard. The great oak door slammed shut behind them, followed by a scream that split the night in two. When silence finally fell, the house of Lisborne was unrecognizable, a carcass of splendor stripped of its soul. Colette appeared from the shadows, her eyes wet but fierce. "It's over, madam," she said softly. Élise looked around the ruined hall, her breath steady. "No, Colette, it has only begun." Outside, the guillotine was being erected in the town square. The age of kings and barons was ending. But even in freedom, Élise knew she carried her own prison within, one built from memories, whispers, and ghosts that would never leave her. As dawn broke, she walked out of the manor for the last time, her bare feet touching the wet earth. Behind her, the wind howled through the empty corridors, a requiem for the house that had devoured so many lives. The bride of shadows was gone. In her place stood something the Baron could never have imagined, a woman unbroken. Years passed, and France was reborn in fire. The revolution devoured its own children, leaving behind a scarred nation haunted by ghosts it could neither name nor bury. The guillotine song had faded, but its memory lingered, sharp, metallic, and eternal. Élise had survived it all. She had fled Lisborne with nothing but the clothes on her back and the journal she once kept in secret. For a time, she wandered from village to village, her noble name erased, her beauty veiled in grief. Yet, wherever she went, whispers followed. Rumors of a pale widow who escaped the vengeance of the people, of a woman who once watched her husband die and did not cry. When peace slowly returned, Élise found herself drawn to Versailles, now a hollow echo of its former glory. The palace that once dazzled the world stood abandoned, its mirrors cracked, its marble cold. Grass grew between the cobblestones where carriages once rolled. She walked to the hall of mirrors, her reflection fractured into 100 broken cells. She had been told the palace was cursed, that those who had bathed in its luxury now haunted its corridors, forever trapped between guilt and grandeur. Some said you could still hear the laughter of courtiers, the rustle of silks, the whisper of doomed prayers before the blade fell. Élise felt it too, the pulse of the past beneath her feet. Each step seemed to awaken voices long silenced. As she passed the grand staircase, she imagined the queen descending it, serene yet doomed, unaware of the storm to come. She wandered until she reached the royal chapel. There, dust danced in beams of morning light, and silence reigned like a final monarch. Élise knelt at the altar, her trembling hands clutching her journal. Inside were pages filled with pain, blood, and memory, a chronicle of women silenced by power. Hers. Isabel's, countless others lost to the cruelty of men and the indifference of history. She whispered, "You are not forgotten." Her voice trembled, then steadied. "I will tell your story." At that moment, the wind swept through the broken glass, and for a heartbeat, Élise thought she heard laughter, soft, melodic, distant. The court of Versailles, still dancing in eternity. But as she rose to leave, she saw something that stopped her heart. Across the chapel, faintly lit by sunlight, stood a woman in a gown of pale blue. Her eyes met Élise, eyes she knew. It was Isabel, or the ghost of what she might have been. And before Élise could speak, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the scent of roses and the echo of a sigh. Élise stood frozen, her breath shallow, her mind struggling to grasp what her eyes had seen. The scent of roses lingered, faint but undeniable, a fragrance she remembered from the chapel at Lisbourne, where Isabel's portrait once hung. For a moment, time itself seemed to fold in on her, and the weight of years pressed upon her chest. She whispered the name again, trembling. Isabel. The silence answered her like a sigh. She moved slowly through the empty chapel, the air heavy with dust and ghosts. Her hand brushed the pews, the carved wood smooth beneath her fingers, as if worn down by centuries of prayer and despair. The walls seemed to breathe. She could almost hear the faint murmur of a mass long past, the clink of jewels, the faint rustle of silk. Versailles was not dead. It merely dreamed. That night, Élise found refuge in a small room once used by a servant of the court. The fireplace had long gone cold, but she lit a candle and opened her journal. Her handwriting had grown unsteady with age, but her words burned with clarity. She wrote of Isabel, of the Baron, of every scream swallowed by the stone walls of Lisbourne. She wrote until dawn, until the candle's flame quivered and died. When morning came, she stepped onto the palace terrace. The gardens stretched before her, wild and overgrown, but still beautiful in their ruin. Birds circled above the fountains, now dry and cracked. She closed her eyes and felt the wind against her face, and for the first time in years, she smiled. The ghosts no longer frightened her. They had followed her not to torment, but to remind her, to make her remember. A historian who passed through Versailles years later would find that same room sealed and untouched. Inside, on a wooden table, lay a single book bound in worn leather, Élise's journal. Its final page bore no words, only a pressed rose and a faint signature, Élise de Lisbourne. He would later describe hearing music in the halls as he read. Faint at first, then swelling. Violins, laughter, the echo of a dance that had long ended, and in the reflection of a cracked mirror, he swore he saw her, a woman in white, walking slowly through the gardens, her gaze distant but peaceful. Some say she still wanders Versailles when the moon is high, not as a ghost of tragedy, but as a guardian of forgotten voices. The palace of kings and tyrants, now silent, belongs to her and the women history tried to erase. In that silence, their stories still breathe. The House of Shadows is gone. The blood of the old world has dried. But the whispers, they remain, waiting for those who dare to listen. For in every crumbling wall, in every portrait left to fade, in every sigh carried by the wind, the ghosts of Versailles still dance.